Hey friends, this is Waylon Lewis of Elephant Journal, and I am coming to you live from Boulder, Colorado. I'm about to have another wonderful guest. We're going to talk about veganism, and any questions you have, any criticisms, anything, as long as it's vaguely respectful, is totally welcome. You're, yeah, welcome.
Hello there.
Hey, thank you so much for joining.
It's my pleasure.
My basic rule for inviting guests on Walk the Talk Show is if I shared your posts or your stories, like, 15 times or more, then, at some point I just have to reach out. So thank you so much for accepting.
I love that. My pleasure.
Yeah. So what are all these wonderful posts you're putting up? What is your passion? Tell us about what makes you excited to wake up in the morning and serve, this world.
So, over 6 years ago, I just made the life decision that I wanted to eat healthier. My dad was severely sick for many years, and I knew I needed to take care of my health and start looking into ways to, be prepared for anything that may happen in the future. So, I stumbled across a documentary called Forks Over Knives, and in it, it teaches the value of plant based eating and how what we eat actually makes a big impact on whether or not we may get chronic diseases. And if we do get chronic diseases, it may lower the impacts of those. And I was, intrigued by this information. I'd never heard it explained that way before. And so I started to eat more towards a whole food plant based diet, but I started off being vegetarian. So I cut out meat first and I was still having a bit of dairy here and there. And then I watched another video that was called Dairy is Scary. And it explains to me in the most visceral, heartbreaking way what happens to cows. And I just didn't want to partake in the dairy industry anymore. And I immediately cut out all dairy products from my diet. And as I became a part of this, whole food plant based lifestyle, and also, decided to call myself a vegan, I felt like I couldn't keep this information to myself. My family needed this information, friends, and I felt like I needed to make a bigger impact. And since, my friends and family, how they don't always listen to you when you start something good. So I was like, well, if my parents, my siblings don't want to go vegan, I'm going to share this with the broader community. And that's when I decided to make my Instagram account, basically just sharing the benefits and value of this lifestyle.
What I love about what you just said is that, often vegan people can be kind of a little bit intense about your motivations for whatever path gets you there. And I love, kind of came at veganism from I also ate meat and dairy and all these things. And I just was like 24 or 25 or something in Boston in the like late 90s when I didn't even really know what vegan was. I remember asking someone like, "What do you guys eat?" And I remember visualizing almonds. And, you know, for me, it was just like, I don't want to be a part of something unethical if I don't know where it came from. So I just tried to like eat meat only when I knew where it came from. And that was such a slippery slope when you start paying attention.
Hmm.
You're like, oh, I can't get pizza from the delivery. I can't, like you basically wind up never eating meat. And when you do know where it comes from, you start looking into that, like you did with that dairy is scary. But
Yeah.
what I love about what your story is, you looked at stuff and you didn't argue with it or deny it or suppress it for 30 years. You just were like, oh, that is not worthy of me being involved in it. Like, I'm going to change. So, how is your health and has your family been inspired health wise by your path?
They definitely have been inspired. And although they haven't gone vegan, they try to eat more plant forward than they ever used to before. And I would say my health is very good. Ever since I went vegan, I feel more energetic and less sluggish than I did before. I have more mental clarity. And for me, it's not only the physical aspect, but the mental aspects. Just knowing that I've taken out my direct a contribution to what's happening to other animals, I do feel some peace from that. And I know that my contribution is not perfect, that we still live under capitalism, but I know that I'm doing at least my part, and on top of that, educating others.
So, the two videos you mentioned are Forks Over Knives and Dairy is Scary.
Yes.
So, probably you would recommend anyone who's curious can check those out.
Absolutely.
So, you mentioned capitalism like not being perfect. We are all part of, I also feel like vegans need to be kind of environmentalists because climate
Mm.
crisis is killing billions of animals and obviously harming the most vulnerable among us humans the hardest. As soon as you get into veganism, it connects with everything else, right? Social justice, climate crisis, uh, voting, voting rights, racism, patriarchy, capitalism. I one thing I've really appreciated is you touch on a lot of those things. How how does that feel to you? Is it like becoming sort of a holistic worldview, or is it still sort of veganism?
Well, for me, when I first became vegan, it was simply about the vegan message, as a lot of vegans come in because of compassion for other animals and not knowing the fact that eating animals, directly contributes to, harm of other beings. And once I had that in mind, I, just like you, I began seeing the connection that this is a social justice movement, because the way that workers are treated in both the animal agriculture industry and in the plant farming industry is horrific. We're exploiting mostly migrant workers and children to do heavy labor. And I just became just digging into everything, digging into every aspect of the food industry and how, food is kept away from people who are the neediest of our population, people who deserve to have access to fresh fruits and vegetables. And we've created in the United States food apartheid. And I call it food apartheid because specifically it's not a food desert, because the desert just means the non existence of those food products. We have more than the ability to make sure everyone has equitable access to food. We're intentionally keeping it away from people who deserve it. And so,
So you're saying like calling it a food desert where, there isn't a good grocery store, local farm or urban farm sort of implies that it's natural, but it's actually apartheid. It's part of the system. It's intentional.
yes, it's built in and it's deliberate separation.
S- So, as a white guy, I'm not in a great position to answer a very common critique. When you're vegan, you immediately trip all the defensive buttons in your friends and they start throwing like pasta on the wall to see if it's al dente. They throw criticisms at us. And often we haven't even brought it up. Like this happened. I literally was just at lunch with a friend who's not vegan. And we talked about veganism for the first 20 minutes because he immediately had questions and arguments and whatever. And I didn't even bring anything up. And at 20 minutes, I was like, you know what? I actually, we're having lunch because I wanted to ask your advice about this other stuff. If you don't mind, let's move on. Because I'm totally genuine, you know, happy to talk with people if they're curious or interested. But
Mhm.
often people just have arguments. One of the arguments is that veganism is, you know, based on privilege. What is, I don't think that's all wrong, by the way, but what is your response to that? Because you posted some good wisdom around that.
Yeah. So there is definitely the aspect of having food access is a privilege, no matter which way you slice it. If you have access to food and you can afford to feed yourself and make your own food choices, and also have the ability to prepare food, which is another thing,
Mm,
you have a privilege and an advantage over other people. But being vegan in and of itself is not a privilege, because veganism is a mindset. It's about doing the least amount of harm as possible to other living beings. And in addition to that, people have been plant based for centuries and even a millennia all around the world. It's the advent of industrial agriculture that has really changed and disrupted our food system. Me being originally from Nigeria, our natural food is fruits, vegetables, grains, starches, corn, millet. Those are the foods that we eat traditionally. And so no one came over and taught us veganism. We were already doing that until animal agriculture became involved, and then people started eating a little bit more meat. But I would say, like, from the rural part, which is where I was born, meat is still not the main cuisine because it's very expensive. You have to be affluent to afford meat. My parents didn't grow up eating meat, and so people have to understand that eating plant based, or at least plant forward, is a traditional diet. It does not
yeah.
necessarily mean that you have an advantage.
Yeah. Well said. I mean, it's much easier generally, historically, to, take some corn uh, off the stalk than it is to raise an animal, feed it corn or whatever, feed it the entire time, make sure it's healthy, nurture an animal to whatever age that you're going to kill it and then consume it. That's much harder. It takes usually without our like weird farm bill subsidies, meat and dairy are more expensive and should be far more expensive and therefore would require much more privilege. But we've kind of twisted it and made factory farming a thing. So, we've cheapened that process somewhat. So, um, yeah, so many questions. So, what are, on a sort of fun note or a practical note, what are a couple dishes? Do you cook at home at all? Are there a few dishes you particularly love that might be like kind of fun or accessible for people that they can make for themselves?
Absolutely. I think that rice is one of the best nutrients. That's kind of like a universal thing.
Mm.
Most countries in the world are already eating rice at the base of their plate. So, what I like to do is I will make rice ahead of time and have it for the next day. So, it does two things for me. One, it allows me to do a simple meal prep, and two, it allows me to use the leftover vegetables in my refrigerator because we all know at the end of the week, you've made different dishes and you have like a little bit of corn, a little bit of broccoli. So I love to put together a stir fry because stir fries, they take minimal effort. And when you already have the rice in advance, it tastes really good with, all of your favorite things. And it's super, fast and tasty to make and has a ton of nutrients.
Yeah, and you can make tons. I have a pressure cooker. Do you use one of those?
Yeah, I use one of
They're
those.
kind of amazing. Can make like so much.
Mhm.
And then do you just keep it in the fridge for a couple days, or do you freeze some of it? Or
When it comes to rice, I actually freeze mine so it lasts a couple of days.
yeah, so yeah, you can make it for your family, whatever. You can make tons of it. Um, and then freezing is sort of magic for a lot of stuff, like bread and whatever. It can come out and just be amazing. So um, there was a question from Nikhil. Thank you. Um, does this affect your, your consumption of fashion, what you buy, what you wear, and makeup, things like that, body care?
Absolutely. I often talk about skincare and, just my lifestyle in general. So for me, I only buy products that are cruelty free and vegan. And the distinction is sometimes a product might be cruelty free, meaning they don't test on animals, but it may still contain beeswax or goat milk and other things like that, meaning that it's not a vegan product. So I always look for vegan and cruelty products both
Yeah.
together. And in addition to that, I don't consume fast fashion. I typically use the clothes that I have for a very long period of time. And then when I need new pieces, I will either go with a sustainable fashion brand or I will, thrift the necessary pieces that I need. But I'm not typically a big shopper. I'm pretty happy with the wardrobe that I have. And I just know if I need something for a particular event, I'll just get that particular item and not, overconsume fashion in general.
Yeah, exactly. I love that. I mean, that's like such an environmental approach as well.